What's going on, everyone? Today we are here in a blizzard and we're going to be breaking down the pros and cons of each propagation growing medium that's available to us as gardeners. Let's go. All right, so we're going to be cutting from the same rosemary that we cut from our last video to keep everything the same. And we're basically going to be seeing how they react to each different propagation medium as the weeks go on. Now, a lot of you wanted to see this because you may not have things like rock wool at your disposal, and you may want to see some of the other options available to you. So because a lot of you kind of chimed in and wanted to see that, we're going to make it happen. Now, I want to remind you all that if you're going to be taking cuttings to propagate, you don't have to be taking just rosemary. You can be taking cuttings from basil, sage, thyme, oregano, mint. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different plants that you can propagate from a simple cutting. So let's take these indoors. It's cold, it's snowing, and we're going to talk about different propagation mediums. All right, so all of our propagation mediums here have one thing in common, regardless if it's vermiculite, sand, potting mix, or rock wool. They all hold on to moisture very well. Having good moisture holding capabilities is key. In fact, it's the most important thing to getting your cuttings to root. If they dry out, they will not root. And so it is super, super important that no matter what medium you choose, you have it hold on to moisture well, because otherwise you're done for. So the first thing we're gonna talk about is vermiculite. So this is vermiculite. Now, vermiculite is an expanded volcanic rock. It is very porous. It's also very lightweight. It has a ton of surface area, allowing for it to hold on to moisture very well. Now, if I were to take this and pour this into my hand, I would say this weighs about maybe 2-3 grams. It is extremely lightweight. If I blow it, that's how easily it blows. So what makes vermiculite so superior is a few things. One is very, very lightweight. It's not very dense. And so roots that form in this are gonna have a very easy time moving throughout the medium. That's the first thing. Second thing is it's extremely porous. Like I said, the fact that I can take this and blow it means that you can actually hold a ton of water in this. All those pores, because it's so open, has a ton of surface area that water can penetrate, and that means it holds on to that moisture incredibly well. If we were to take some water, check this out, look at this. It doesn't float like you think it would. The water just fills it up. And then the excess water can get poured out, but what's left is now incredibly dense because of all that moisture. And that means that there's actually a really high ratio of moisture to medium, which is fantastic because in most cases, if you had this much moisture in a soil, it would be oversaturated, and your rooting, whatever you're rooting, your cutting, would actually have a really high chance of rotting. It's not the case with this. This actually gives you an advantage of having excess moisture without increased risk of rot. And that is awesome. This potting mix also makes a wonderful rooting medium. Now, why is that? Well, it's comprised of mostly sphagnum peat moss or coconut husk fiber, which makes it really fluffy, but also has things like perlite and vermiculite, which help with drainage, aeration, and water holding capabilities. Now, if I were to take this, a little bit blows away, but I really gotta blow pretty hard in order to actually get it to move, meaning it's a tad bit more dense, actually a decent amount more dense than the vermiculite is. The vermiculite's density, most of it comes from the moisture that keeps it dense. Otherwise, the tiniest sneeze will send it flying. This potting mix is dense enough that it kind of holds its own, and I like that because it gives something that actually gives a little bit of heft to the mix, to the rooting medium, but also it holds on to moisture really well as well. Now, it won't hold on to as much moisture as the vermiculite will, but a lot of that sphagnum peat moss and coconut husk fiber adds a lot of porosity that is very similar to the vermiculite. Now, one nice upside to using the potting mix is that the peat moss is soilless. It does not have any soil actually in there. And we talked about how you want to make sure that you have a very sterile medium, because if you have things like mold and mildew spores, if you go out and dig some soil from your garden and just throw it in a cup in here, it is absolutely going to cause problems over the course of 5 to 7 weeks. With something like this rosemary, you're absolutely going to have things like root rot or damping off or just any type of rot or mold, because the moisture that's required to set roots is going to also harbor things like mold and mildew. And in soil, there's millions of mold and mildew spores, whereas this might have a tiny bit, but far less than something that had soil. So there's no compost in here. There's no like worm castings or anything like that in here. It's quite sterile. In fact, there's not even really any nutrients in here. It's literally just sphagnum peat moss, which is essentially inert. And then you have the perlite, which adds to aeration and drainage. And then you have a tiny bit of vermiculite, which helps with moisture holding capabilities. This is sand. Sand, because it's got things like quartz, it's got things like sandstone, granite. There's so many different sand particles that make up sand. This actually is incredibly dense, which helps you to actually have a nice body to the mix. Only downside is the fact that because it's so dense, it can have a tendency to compact. And if you don't have the right type of sand, you can actually choke off or smother the roots from forming on things like new cuttings. And so if we were to take our rosemary cutting and stick it in this sand, we'd want to make sure that it has the right type of granular particulate. And basically what we're looking for, it's known as aggregate. The aggregate that you're looking for is a coarse sand. This is actually a very fine sand. And so this was merely used for an example. This would not make a very good rooting medium, but a coarse sand like this is actually known as masonry sand. Masonry sand is super, super, super fine. Whereas like a playground sand or even a beach sand has a much higher, has a much more particulate, right? It has a much larger particle size. And so the aggregate of that is going to allow for better aeration, still going to be very dense, but that aeration is very important for allowing the roots to develop as well as hold on to moisture, which is the next thing that sand does very well. Sand, much like vermiculite, holds on to water exceedingly well. Now the downside is that because it does not have that really good aggregate, it actually will become quite compacted. This is for anyone that has ever done things like hydroponics. You'll notice that this is known as rock wool. Now rock wool is actually incredibly lightweight. It is very similar in the porosity or the surface area to vermiculite, only the fact that this is completely inert. This is actually all made from spun glass fibers. It's very similar to like fiberglass insulation. And what makes this awesome is the fact that because it's so lightweight, but it's also super absorbent, you can take this block here and pour your water in here, and it will absorb that water, no problem at all. Now, I'm obviously going to take some of this water and dump it back out, but you'll notice very little water came out, and that's because most of it is being absorbed by this block. Another thing about this that makes it really nice is the fact that it's probably the most sterile of all of these options. Because it's so compacted, and because of the fact that it's it's a manufactured product. I mean, like this could be manufactured, but it's like earth-made, right? This is man-made, and so because of that, it's incredibly sterile. So if you're doing something that requires precision and it takes a long time to root, rock wool is absolutely my favorite choice. Now, a couple negatives with using rock wool is that you actually need to, it's not always going to be something that's going to have a good form factor. So like you can pour a cup of vermiculite and it'll take the shape of whatever container you're rooting. I had to actually kind of rip off some of the corners so it fit well in this cup. Otherwise, it was way too snug. So it doesn't have a great form factor, which is one downside. Second downside is the fact that when you do actually rip it, you want to make sure you do that when it's wet, because you don't want to be breathing rock wool fibers. It's not good whatsoever to be breathing. Once it's wet though, you can rip this and it's completely safe. There's no rock wool fibers entering the air because it's all wet. But then the final downside to rock wool, and there's only a couple downsides, but the other downside is the fact that the roots will get very intertwined in this. And sometimes I find that if I'm moving from rock wool into the garden, it becomes a little challenging to have a successful plant get transplanted because this holds on to a lot of moisture still. And in the garden, sometimes we don't want that much moisture. And because of that, this can actually cause things like rot out in the garden because again, this is gonna hold on to a lot of moisture, but now you're in an environment that has a lot of mold and mildew spores. Moisture plus mold and mildew equals rot. And so every once in a while, I do find that I have problems transplanting these out into the garden. Not all the time, I've done it successfully many times, but on occasion, some will rot. So there is a couple downsides to using rock wool, but in my opinion, it's probably the best in terms of sterility and the fact that it holds on to moisture so well. So we're gonna take this, clip that back. Then we're gonna take these leaves, remove those lower leaves. We're gonna take our pruners, we're gonna strip off that outer layer, exposing the green cambium layer. Get it damp with some water, stick it in a rooting hormone powder, pop it in the rock wool, just like that. Rooting hormone and sand. Same thing, stick it in the potting mix. These methods are very good for the home gardener. The method that we did was actually a combination of sand and vermiculite. So we did a 1-to-1 blend of sand and vermiculite, and that's what we did at the greenhouse. Worked incredibly well, and that really allowed us then, once the roots formed, what we did is we actually took the cuttings out, we shook off the sand, and it allowed all that medium to slough off, so then we could throw it into something like a potting mix very simply. There was nothing really stopping it, and we could really crowd them in nice and close. So there's a lot of different options for you as a home gardener, but as a professional in a commercial greenhouse, you want to be super efficient. You want to be really really precise with what you're doing. And we didn't have any flexibility for things like mold and mildew. It was very sterile, very controlled. We had to wear booties on our feet. We had to wash our hands. We had to wear a hairnet. It was incredibly sterile because of all of that. And that's just because one bad thing goes wrong and you can ruin literally millions of dollars in cuttings. And so it was a very high pressure, kind of a fun thing, but just very time consuming and tedious. So yeah, so there you go. There are 4 different rooting mediums for you to do cuttings. All will work. Just make sure you get the right ones and follow these steps and you should have success. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, make sure to hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you've ever rooted cuttings, let me know which one is your favorite. Do you prefer rock wool, sand, vermiculite, a combination of both like we did at the greenhouse, potting mix? Let me know. I'm super curious. So as always, hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll catch you guys later. Grow bigger.